Just a brief word. After you're done listening to this episode, make sure you check out the Calendrical Holmes over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We'll make sure to put a link in the show notes for you.
This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 413, The Newgate Calendar. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, do you have all of your important dates noted in your calendar for the rest of the year?
Yes, I've got figs, and I also have some sugared pineapple and papaya.
Lovely. You and your dates. That's not what I meant when I asked you to get on the latest dating app.
Oh, no.
I meant carbon dating. Carbon dating
I've got
app.
all this dried fruit. Well, I was going to find out how old it was, but I've got to set fire to it first.
Well, prepare yourself because you're going to have to bring us some figgy pudding later this month. Well, welcome to Trifles. We have an interesting episode ahead today. It's something that just came to us from one of those things where you're reading a story and you come across a phrase and you go, that would make an interesting discussion on Trifles. And here we have it. So we're going to be talking all about the Newgate Calendar today. And we'll have some sidebars and some additional commentary therein. But strap in. It's going to be a fascinating discussion here that gets to a lot of non-Sherlockian things, but gives you a lot of background for what Sherlock Holmes was talking about in one of the stories. Just a reminder, if you'd like to support the show, go ahead and do that at Substack or Patreon, whatever works for you. You can become a member there. We recently had a fan reach out to us and ask about a one-time donation. We can make that possible as well. So check us out. All the show notes, ways to contact us are on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. The email address here is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And, of course, you can contact us as I Hear of Sherlock across any of the major social networks where we are active. Again, all the links are in the show notes, and we recommend that you take part in that. And stay tuned, because after the discussion, we will have our monthly drawing for all of our supporters. All of you are eligible if you support the show at any level. We'll be giving away a back issue of the Baker Street Journal to a randomly selected person. So stay tuned for that. Well, Burt, where is it that we find a mention of the Newgate Calendar anywhere in the Sherlock Holmes stories?
Well, if you put down your dates and get to the Newgate, you will find it referred to in the collection of good old Nathan Garrideb. Because what happens in the case of the three Garridebs is that there comes a point where Holmes has identified the malefactor here. And he explains who it is to Watson, and Watson basically says, well, I don't know anything about that. And Holmes says, it's not part of your profession to carry about a portable Newgate calendar in your memory. Well, he says he's gone down to see Lestrade, and because, while they're not very imaginative, they have thoroughness and method. And he had the idea that he could get on the track of this evildoer in their records. And sure enough, he found it in the Rogues Gallery in Scotland Yard. And that whole reference, Newgate Calendar, refers to, I suppose, what you could consider to be one of the earliest compiled lists of things involving evildoers in England, although I think the way it started in the very early 18th century was as a list of executions, and it refers to Newgate, which was the site of a famous prison, the Newgate prison.
Oh, I thought it was Newgate prison where they kept the Three Musketeers.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's, what everyone asks me every once in a while, a lot of people do, not everyone, whatever happened to Bonomo Turkish Taffy? And actually, it was held captive at Newgate prison for a while.
Oh, everyone needs nougat. Yeah. Well, Newgate, as it's spelled, Newgate, perhaps colloquially pronounced as Newgate in the local area. This was a prison. And it was I don't know if it was notorious, as one of these hellholes, but it was at the corner of Newgate Street and Old Bailey, just inside the city of London. And it was the site of Newgate, which was a gate in the original Roman wall around London. And it was built in the 12th century and demolished in 1904. So over the course of those 700 years or so, it was extended and rebuilt many times. So it was a major part of the city's history for most of its history. And in the late 18th century, the site of official hangings in the city of London, were moved to the Newgate prison from Tyburn. Of course, Tyburn was, the tree, the public place around the Tower of London, where hangings were originally held, executions, and they were moved to Newgate prison in the late 18th century.
Fascinating. Yeah. It's interesting when you look at the history of it to find the discrepancies, because depending on where you're looking, you will read confidently that it goes back to 1705. Oh, no. There was a standard edition in 1774. Oh, no. There actually it was this list of executions put out by the keeper of the Newgate prison, and that was in 1705. But it's fascinating, regardless of all of this. The reason why all this is important or interesting, at least to us anyway, or at least to me, is that it had such an influence on crime fiction, and the whole idea of these offenses that this was sort of the gutter popular press at the time, and it included the details of all of these executions, but also illustrations and woodcuts of murders and things that, just the most awful, grotesque stuff. And apparently people couldn't get enough of it. And there was a penny dreadful edition, a penny newspaper version of it that came out as late as the 1860s. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the public's appetite for, certainly violence, but also justice. They wanted to see justice done, particularly when there were such horrible criminals committing these crimes. But going back to the ancient days of Rome, bread and circuses, giving people these violent exploits they could watch, all the way up to, just what I mentioned before, the public executions where people would watch criminals being hanged or being beheaded. And I suppose if your schedule had you otherwise occupied that day and you couldn't attend one of these festive events, well, the broadsheets would have their accounts for you. You know, they not only talked about, of course, the execution of these individuals, but the background, their stories, their histories that got them to that location in the first place. And as you say, they were produced as very cheap penny dreadfuls, broadsheets or chapbooks, and they were sold at fairs and sold by, basically door-to-door salesmen, itinerant peddlers, and sold at the executions themselves. Programs, get your programs here. And they included the last words of the condemned man before he had even spoken them. Right, so it was a whole industry there dedicated to executions and horrible criminals.
Now, do you know the bizarre connection between classical music and the Newgate Calendar?
I do not.
Well, you will in a moment. And it's unfortunate. It's interesting, but it's not as interesting as the question. Isn't that a great question? It all goes down to the New York Times, because the New York Times published a book review. Well, they've published a book review for a very, very long time, but they had a crime column that began, I think, in the 1970s. And the author of the crime column, when you looked at it, crime in the New York Times, on the Sunday paper, was Newgate Calendar, except it was 2 L's. So Newgate Calendar. And that was the pseudonym, the nom de plume of Harold Schoenberg, who was the chief music critic of the New York Times. And he was the first guy, I think, who ever won a Pulitzer Prize. Oh, no, he became the first music critic to ever win a Pulitzer Prize for criticism. And he was a very interesting guy and carried that. I always used to turn to the New York Times on Sundays to see what was going on in crime. And he reviewed all of those great early Sherlockian books. I think he reviewed Nick Meyer's 7% Solution and Jack Tracy's Encyclopedia and all kinds of stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that connection. Well, I think what's particularly interesting here about the Newgate Calendar and why it was relevant for Sherlock Holmes is, recall in A Study in Scarlet, Watson had just met Holmes and was trying to size the man up, assess what he was good at, what his skills were, and of course he made that wonderful list, Sherlock Holmes, His Limits. And number 9 on that list was sensational literature. And Watson ranked Holmes's knowledge of sensational literature as immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. Well, this is exactly the kind of material that would have been covered in the Newgate Calendar. And we have a link in the show notes to a website of Pascal Bonenfant. And there is a complete index of entries for the Newgate Calendar, separated by centuries. So if we wanted to place ourselves in Sherlock Holmes's time and take a look through the Newgate Calendar for entries from 1801 onwards, let's just pull out at random some of the individuals we might find there and see exactly who they are. Let's look. I'm just going to pull one here without having looked at it before. Arthur Bailey, executed at Ilchester, 11th of September, 1811, for stealing a letter from the post office at Bath. He was a man of unblemished character, supporting an amiable wife and several children. Had long been in the confidence of the postmaster at Bath, who entrusted him with sorting all of the letters. And through robberies, though robberies had frequently been practiced upon the office, letters missed, yet it was some time ere suspicion fell upon Bailey as the plunderer. And at length, however, justice, slow yet sure, overtook him. He was convicted at the summer assizes of stealing from the Bath post office a letter containing bills, the property of Messrs. Slack linen drapers, and of forging an endorsement on one of the said bills. And for that, he was taken out of prison a little after 8 o'clock in the morning, placed in a cart, attended by Mr. Meliar, the undersheriff, and the chaplain of the prison. He showed the greatest firmness on the way to the fatal tree, and when under the gallows, he joined fervently in prayer and addressed the spectators audibly, "I hope you will all take warning," and then holding a prayer book in his hand, said, "I beg you to look into this book often, and you will not come to shame. Be sure and honest and not covet money, cursed money, and particularly money that is not your own." He was then deprived of his mortal state of existence, dying without a struggle. Yeah, those don't sound like the words that he would have actually uttered. Those seem to have been scripted in advance, I would wager, to one Arthur Bailey.
Amazing.
No.
Well, it's this, and that's sort of the influence of all of this and the connection to crime fiction, because, on the one hand, people were worried that when you put these publications out, you inspire a lot of copycat criminals and it becomes romantic. But then you have these stories like Arthur Bailey's of remorse and regret, his last words being, look to the Bible, look to the prayer book, follow the good path. And all of that, is such elements of fiction in those days.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. Even then, though, and today we've got the true crime things on television that have just been such a fixture for the last 20 years. Really amazing.
Now, here's another interesting one. And, I've kind of scrolled through here looking for inspirations because, remember, Sherlock Holmes said there's nothing new under the sun. So the reason for wanting to keep himself up to speed on all of these old crimes is to look for trends, look for patterns, and look for where they might be repeating. For example, in 18, where is this one? Edward Gibbon Wakefield, William Wakefield, and Francis Wakefield. This would have been sometime in the 1820s. They were guilty of romancing a wealthy heiress who was abducted and married at Gretna Green.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, the extraordinary abduction of Miss Turner, a wealthy heiress, the daughter of Mr. Turner, a gentleman of highest respectability, excited an unusual degree of interest. The notoriety of the case renders it unnecessary for us to do more than give a general history of the circumstances attending the abduction and the final termination of the proceedings against the defendants, the Wakefields. Miss Turner had just entered her 15th year.
Aww.
Her father was a man of large property and high sheriff at Cheshire. Obviously, these three, the Wakefields, were looking to partake in the family inheritance. Now, let me put this to you, Bert. Does that sound like any Sherlock Holmes story?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, it sounds like elements. Certainly Solitary Cyclist, about a woman who's, tried to be forced into a marriage because of her inheritance. What year was that?
They don't give an exact date, but it happened sometime in the 1820s. Some of the proceedings happened in 1827. And then the execution. And ultimately, there was a motion made in the House of Lords to bring a bill to annul the marriage between Miss Turner and Mr. Wakefield.
Wonder what happened to Miss Turner. Actually, her great-granddaughter became
Alice.
Her granddaughter became a temporary landowner on Baker Street, and it was Mrs. Turner who briefly took over from Mrs. Hudson when Watson and Holmes were there at one point.
Yes, and managed to live quite well thanks to Holmes's princely rent payments.
Yeah.
Wow. But I mean, this is fascinating where we see this inspiration. And Holmes just mentioned it in an offhand manner in the three Garridebs like this. And here we can dig into this and go down so many different rabbit holes. For our subscribers, our paid subscribers on Patreon and Substack, we have an embed of one of the editions of the Newgate Calendar, a digital edition from 1795. So you can take a look at the show notes there and check that out. We'll also have links to some of the other tales we talked about here to help inform you.
Well, you're going to want to look at all of that stuff.
Well, of course,
folks, and you're going to enjoy those things that you Patreon supporters get to see, because among the appendices you can find in some of these links, I got to give you a list of these things: the origin of the gibbet in England, the maiden or the Scottish guillotine, the punishment of whipping in England, Russia, and France, an account of the various modes of punishment for adultery in distant nations, torture, swindling, an expose of gambling, coining, pretended ghosts, witchcraft, voluntary punishment of Gentoo widows on the death of their husbands, trial by ordeal of the Hindus in the East, Chinese punishments, Turkish punishments inflicted on knavish butchers and bakers. And all of that is waiting to soothe you at the end of a long day as you try to drift off to sleep with your iPad in your lap, looking at these wonderful attachments, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling until 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, just the thing everyone needs.
Yeah.
Wow.
Woo.
Well, to kind of put your mind to rest until then, let's turn to the big prize wheel here, because we have Baker Street Journal, back issue of the Baker Street Journal to give away, and we will want to give people an opportunity to hear who won it this time. So let's give the prize wheel a big spin down there, and landing on number 26, and that looks like it is Jesse Martin.
Hooray!
Jesse, congratulations. We will be sending you a copy of the back issue of the Baker Street Journal. If you'd like to be like Jesse and have an opportunity to win, just make sure you go to our Patreon or Substack site. Again, links are in the show notes. Well, that'll do it for the month of November. Bert, we have, how many episodes left before the end of the season? 5.
Oh,
5
good.
episodes left. My goodness. And we will end the season on 417. How many more episodes until 500 when we can put a pin in this show?
Is that what happens?
I don't know.
Sounds like that's what you want. What you want for Christmas is an end.
Yeah, this is a treadmill of sorts, a trifling treadmill.
I love it.
Lest I end up at the Newgate prison myself.
Well, it's 80. I mean, it's according to your calculations, it's 83 more weeks.
Let the countdown begin.
Bum, bum, bum.
Well, until that time, friends, it just remains a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
From the point of view of the criminal expert, London has become a singularly uninteresting city.
Well, I hardly think you'll find many decent citizens to agree with you.